It was 2:30 in the morning when the sketch first took shape. My name is Luana, and I've been an architect for almost 20 years. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was wired, racing from weeks of routine meetings, endless client demands, and an office culture that seemed more concerned with optics than impact. I needed to do something that felt real again. So I got up, made some tea, and sat cross-legged on the living room floor with a stack of blank paper. I didn't plan anything. The idea just poured out. An open, sustainable community center that wouldn't just serve as a space, but as a symbol. Natural ventilation corridors, a green roof that harvested rainwater, repurposed wood from demolished city structures. Every line on the page felt like a return to why I'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. By the time the sun came up, I had 5 pages of rough sketches and a full concept outline. It wasn't polished, but it had a soul. At the office that Monday, I brought the idea to the development meeting. I remember holding my breath as I clicked through the slides I had stayed up all weekend preparing. There was silence when I finished. Then, nods. Real ones. Even applause. My director, Sylvia, said, This could be something big, Luana." The weeks that followed were electric. I was asked to prepare a full proposal. I worked late nights, refining the concept, consulting with sustainability experts, and even reaching out to local artists for input on how the building could reflect our city's culture. It felt like everything I had worked for, my values, my experience, my instincts, was finally aligning. That's why I didn't notice at first how some people began attaching themselves to the project in subtle ways. A junior associate offering to reformat my presentation deck. Another asking to help revise the scope document. I thought it was team spirit, but things were shifting, and I hadn't yet realized just how far they would go. The weeks turned into months, and the project evolved into something much larger than I had first imagined. I was still at the center of it, or at least I thought I was. Meetings with engineers, calls with the city's environmental office, late-night revisions to the cost modeling spreadsheets. I handled all of it. My desk became a war zone of coffee-stained blueprints, annotated printouts, and concept renders. It wasn't just work. I was living that project. We named it Viva Centro, and it became a buzzword across the firm. At one point, I overheard someone in the elevator say, "Oh, that green building thing? That's Luana's baby." I smiled quietly. It wasn't about ego. It was about finally creating something that aligned with my purpose. But slowly, that narrative started to shift. First, it was subtle. Bruno, a junior architect who'd barely been in the firm for 2 years, began sitting in on my planning calls without invitation. He'd nod, take notes, then offer to take care of certain tasks. I thought he was just eager. Then came the email signatures. Reports that I had authored were being sent out with Bruno and another associate, Clara, listed as the primary contacts. When I brought it up to Sylvia, she brushed it off. "We're showcasing team effort," she said. "Don't worry, everyone knows your role." I did worry, but I didn't push. At the internal presentation review, I noticed my name had been moved from lead designer to collaborator. I mentioned it to Bruno during a coffee break. "Oh, it was just a formatting issue," he said, too quickly. "I'll fix it." He never did. Still, I told myself to stay focused. I kept working because the project mattered more than recognition. I believed that if I just kept doing the right thing, it would all sort itself out. But beneath that belief, something heavier was forming, something like betrayal, quiet and growing. And I was still calling it teamwork. It started with the meetings. One morning, I opened my calendar to see a project sync that had been moved, again without any notice. When I asked Clara about it in the hallway, she smiled thinly and said, "Oh, didn't Bruno loop you in? We just needed to be quick." I nodded, pretending it was fine, even though it wasn't the first time. Or the second. Then came the emails. Threads I should have been copied on stopped showing up in my inbox. I only found out about them later, when documents needed my review, or when decisions had already been made. Each time, the response was the same. "Sorry, must have been a glitch. You know how Outlook is." But Outlook wasn't the problem. I began to realize that I was being intentionally sidelined. My sketches were now used in presentations where my name didn't appear. Bruno started giving updates to directors about phases of the project he'd barely touched. And Clara, once my closest collaborator, began quoting "we" when referencing decisions I wasn't part of. What stung the most wasn't just being excluded, it was the precision of it. No confrontation, no demotion, just this slow, quiet erasure of everything I'd poured myself into. I tried talking to Sylvia again. I brought a folder of internal documents showing where I'd been left out or replaced. She didn't even look through them. "Luana," she said gently, "I know it feels personal, but these shifts are normal. You've done so much already. Maybe take a breather. Let the others lead this phase." That was the moment I understood. They were pushing me out of my own work, softly, professionally, without raising a single voice. Because if I got angry, I'd look emotional. And if I stayed quiet, I'd disappear. I remember standing in the bathroom after that meeting, staring at myself in the mirror. My hands were shaking, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked back to my desk, opened my files, and began to take note, carefully, quietly, of everything. The internal launch presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. It was meant to be a celebration, a preview of the work before it went public, before investors and media would see it. I had been waiting for that moment for almost a year. My slides were ready, my notes rehearsed. I arrived early just to feel grounded. The room slowly filled. Coffee cups, polished shoes, half-whispered excitement. And then Bruno walked in with a hard drive. Clara followed, carrying a printed version of the deck I had worked on. Only it looked different. They didn't meet my eyes. I knew something was off before the screen even turned on. And then there it was. Slide after slide, my work presented flawlessly, confidently, without a single mention of me. My sketches, now cleaned and digitally enhanced, were labeled under Viva Centro Team. My research graphs had been redesigned, stripped of footnotes that referenced my name. A quote I had written in the original concept paper, word for word, now appeared under Bruno's voiceover as he narrated. I sat there, frozen. No one in the room seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. When it ended, the directors applauded. People came up to Bruno and Clara, congratulating them on leading such an innovative concept. I stood near the back, waiting. Someone finally turned to me and said, "Oh, you were involved too, right?" I smiled. From the beginning. Later, in the hallway, I caught Bruno alone and asked, as calmly as I could, "Why wasn't I listed as lead?" He barely hesitated. There were too many names, and we didn't want to overcrowd the slides. "You're still in the internal notes." I nodded, like that made sense. But it didn't. And it wouldn't. Not ever again. That night, I went home, turned off my phone, and opened every file I had ever saved about the project. Emails, drafts, original designs, meeting recordings. I started backing everything up, quietly, carefully, because I finally understood that this wasn't about being overlooked, it was about being erased. The next morning, I didn't go to work. Instead, I stayed at home, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, an external hard drive, and a folder of scribbled notes and printed emails. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was proof. Proof that I had been there from the start, that every key decision had passed through my hands. And if they wanted to rewrite the story, I was going to make sure the original version didn't vanish. I began with the basics. Email threads dating back to the first concept pitch. I searched by keywords: initial proposal, concept draft, green roof, community layout. In the early days, every thread began with, "Luana, what do you think?" Or, "Luana's idea might work here." I saved everything. Then I moved to my sketches. I found the scanned copies of the drawings I'd made that first night on the floor, still time-stamped. I matched them against the final renders, identical in structure, layout, even the lighting concept I had proposed. My notebooks were next. I flipped through them, page by page, highlighting ideas, meeting notes, and even quick quotes from investors during our early talks. I had scribbled everything back then, out of habit. Now, each note felt like a lifeline. What struck me most was the audio files. I'd forgotten I used to record our brainstorming sessions, mostly so I could transcribe details later. In one file, you could hear my voice leading the meeting. Let's think of the building as a lung for the neighborhood. You could hear Bruno agreeing, Clara chiming in, all of it documented. And so I began organizing it. I created a timeline, every phase of the project, what I did, who was present, what documents supported it. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to a former intern, Andre, who had left the company 6 months ago. He had helped with the concept visuals early on and had no loyalty to Bruno or Clara. "Of course I remember," he said. "You ran everything." "Why?" "I just need a copy of the renders you worked on," I said. "The first versions, with the metadata." "Sure, I still have the files." That night, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: clarity and control. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was recognition. Quiet, deserved, and undeniable. After organizing everything, I realized that there was one path that didn't involve confrontation or escalation within the firm. It involved going above them. I remembered that the investors, particularly 2 from the Cultural Development Fund, hadn't been fully looped in during the final design stages. I had met them early on, during preliminary meetings. One of them, Mr. Rios, had even complimented my vision directly. So I reached out. I didn't use my company email. I sent a polite, professional message from my personal account, requesting a brief coffee meeting to discuss some important clarifications about Viva Centro. To my surprise, Mr. Rios replied the same day. "Of course. Tomorrow afternoon?" We met in a quiet cafe near the old theater district. I brought a leather folder with printed timelines, early renders, and the sketch copies. I didn't speak with bitterness or accusation. I simply told the story, in the order it happened. At first, he looked confused. Then his face changed. These are your original designs?" he asked, holding up the first draft I'd drawn on graph paper. "Yes. I can show you the digital timestamps too." He leaned back. "But you're not even listed in the investor brief. We were told Clara and Bruno were the core leads." I nodded slowly. "That's what they want you to believe. But I thought you deserved to know the truth since it's your money funding this." He sat in silence for a moment. Then, "Would you be willing to share this with the foundation board?" I said yes. That weekend, I prepared a digital folder with everything. Not accusations, just facts, dates, files, evidence. I wrote a cover letter explaining the timeline. By Monday, I had a response. "Thank you for your transparency. We are reviewing this internally." I didn't hear anything else for days. At work, things carried on as usual. Bruno talked louder. Clara hosted a team lunch. I was still invisible, but I no longer felt powerless. I had shifted the weight of the truth to people who actually had the power to act on it. With the press conference only days away, the entire office buzzed with rehearsals, layout printings, and last-minute design tweaks. It was all about Viva Centro now, our landmark sustainable project, as Bruno called it in a company-wide email, without once mentioning my name. I watched it unfold like someone staring at their own reflection through glass. There, but unreachable. They had booked the auditorium downtown. Media outlets were confirmed. The presentation would be led by Bruno and Clara, flanked by the executive team. It was their moment, and I was expected to attend as a silent observer. No one looked at me differently. No one apologized. That was the most surreal part. It was as if I had never been part of it to begin with. Even Sylvia avoided eye contact, barely acknowledging me in meetings. I stayed quiet, but I watched everything. One afternoon, I walked past a conference room and saw Bruno rehearsing his speech. He was standing in front of a mirror, reciting lines I had written months ago, phrases about the building breathing with the city, and architecture as a social act. Word for word. I stood there for a few seconds, then moved on. At my desk, I finished the documentation I had been quietly assigned to wrap up. No one bothered me. In their eyes, I was already gone. But I wasn't. The day before the conference, I received a brief email from the foundation board. We appreciate your initiative. Your presence is requested at tomorrow's event. Please check in at the front desk upon arrival. That was it. No explanation, no forward, no CC. I said nothing. At home, I laid out the same black blazer I'd worn the day I presented Viva Centro for the first time. I didn't know what was going to happen, but for the first time in weeks, I felt still. There's a kind of silence that chokes you, and another kind that centers you. I had lived both. Now I was ready to let the truth speak. The lights dimmed in the auditorium, and the hum of voices quieted as the spotlight hit the stage. I sat in the third row, my badge clipped to my blazer, my hands still. Around me were executives, journalists, and guests from the foundation. Cameras were already rolling. Bruno stepped up to the podium. He was confident. He smiled at the audience like he'd practiced it 100 times. His voice was steady as he introduced Viva Centro. The screen behind him lit up with glossy renderings, my renderings, the ones I had sketched by hand that first sleepless night. He spoke of sustainability, of innovation, of the vision behind the building. He thanked the firm for its support. He named Clara. He named Sylvia. But not me. I sat there and felt nothing. No rage, no panic. Just quiet anticipation, like watching the final seconds before a curtain lifts. And then, just as he moved to click the next slide, the CEO stood up. Before we continue, he said into the mic, I'd like to pause the presentation briefly. Bruno froze. Sure. The CEO stepped forward. There's someone in this room who hasn't been properly acknowledged today. Someone who laid the foundation, literally and figuratively, for everything you've just seen. The crowd shifted. I felt every head slowly turn in my direction, but I didn't move. Luana, he said, looking at me, could you please come up? I stood up slowly, heart pounding but feet firm. I walked to the stage under full light, cameras following. I could see Clara's face, pale and unreadable. Bruno had stepped aside, lips pressed into a thin line. This, the CEO continued, gesturing to the screen, was her vision, her concept, her work. And thanks to her documentation and clarity, we now know exactly how it came to be. He handed me the clicker. I looked out into the crowd. I saw Mr. Rios nod once. I took a breath. And then I finished the presentation. Not with pride, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone reclaiming what was hers. The applause at the end wasn't loud. It was long. And no one clapped louder than the investors. The next morning, the office was quiet. People said hello, but it was restrained, careful. The kind of silence that follows a storm no one expected. Bruno wasn't at his desk. Clara came in late. Sylvia avoided the common area altogether. I sat at my workstation like I always had, logged in, and started answering emails. No one mentioned the presentation, but the emails told a different story. One from the CEO. We'll be reviewing project leadership roles moving forward. Let's schedule a one-on-one. Another from the board liaison. The foundation was impressed. Thank you for your professionalism. Midday, Clara knocked gently on my desk divider. Hey, she said, barely audible. Can we talk? I turned. She didn't meet my eyes. I didn't know how far it had gone. I thought you were just stepping back. I didn't mean... I held up a hand. It's done. She nodded and walked away. Later that week, Bruno was moved to a different team. Something low profile, off client. Word spread quickly. Some said it was a soft demotion. Others whispered about an ethics review. He didn't say goodbye, just cleared his desk and left before noon. Sylvia was more subtle. She remained in her role, but was removed from the Viva Centro follow-ups. Her calendar suddenly filled with internal sessions titled Strategic Realignment. As for me, I received an offer. The CEO wanted me to lead a new initiative, directly under his wing. We need leadership that puts integrity first, he said. I accepted. 2 weeks later, my name appeared in the company newsletter, not buried in small print, not as a courtesy mention, but bolded, highlighted. Luana Martins, lead architect, Viva Centro. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't need to. Instead, I took a quiet walk past the construction site where the first beams were being placed. I watched the workers setting foundations on the same grid I'd drawn months ago. No applause, no headlines, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had built it, and no one could take that away now. It would have been easy to scream, to confront Bruno in front of everyone, to demand credit from Sylvia, to write angry emails or threaten legal action, but I didn't. Not because I was afraid, because I knew that in the world I worked in, noise gets ignored, but silence, real silence, intentional silence, carries weight. In those weeks of being erased, I discovered something I hadn't realized I still had. Control. Not over others, not over the system, but over how I chose to respond. I could have burned bridges. Instead, I documented. I listened. I waited. And in that waiting, I found strength. Looking back, I can see how fragile their plan really was. It depended entirely on me disappearing, on me accepting that I was invisible. But I didn't. I stayed. I watched. I prepared. And when the time came, I didn't have to destroy anyone. They unraveled themselves. Bruno made himself small, not because I exposed him, but because the truth did. Clara disappeared from the spotlight she had fought so hard to share. And Sylvia? I think she understood what she lost more than anyone. Not a title, not a role, but credibility. Trust. Now, I lead projects where my voice is heard from the beginning. I mentor younger architects, especially women, who've been told to wait their turn. I tell them not to wait. I still have the original sketches from that night on the floor. I framed one and hung it in my new office. It reminds me not of what they did, but of what I built. From nothing, with no one watching. And if there's one truth I carry with me, it's this. They tried to take my name off the story, but they forgot. I was the one who wrote it.